The sharp knock echoed through the quiet house, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Emma Hill froze in her living room, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her pale face. Outside, blue and red lights from the police cruiser flashed against her curtains, painting the room in ominous streaks of color. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the door, each beat a deafening reminder of the mistake that had brought her here. "Mrs. Hill, this is the police," came a firm voice from the other side. "We need to speak with you." Emma's hands trembled as she clutched the back of the sofa for support. She had always prided herself on being the unofficial gatekeeper of Elmwood, the pristine suburban neighborhood where she had lived for nearly 2 decades. From organizing block parties to reporting any suspicious behavior to the HOA, Emma had made it her mission to ensure that Elmwood remained perfect, or at least her version of perfect. But tonight, perfection had turned to chaos. She knew why they were here. Of course, she knew. The freedom flag, the truck, the man across the street, Jack Miller. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, as if willing herself to wake up from a bad dream. How did it come to this? She thought. It wasn't supposed to go this far. She had been trying to protect the neighborhood, to uphold the standards she believed in. And now, she was the one in trouble. The knocking grew louder. "Mrs. Hill, open the door, please." Her legs felt like lead as she shuffled toward the entryway. With shaking hands, she unlocked the door and pulled it open, revealing 2 officers standing on her porch. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression neutral but professional. The other, a shorter woman with sharp eyes, held a clipboard in her hand. "Mrs. Hill," the male officer began, "we're here regarding a complaint from your neighbor, Mr. Miller. It seems you've been impersonating a representative of the Elmwood HOA and filing false claims to have his property removed." Emma's stomach dropped. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and she felt the heat of shame creeping up her neck. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but no words came. What could she say? That she had meant well? That she had only wanted to maintain order in the neighborhood? The officers weren't here for excuses. The female officer held up the clipboard. "We have a report, security footage, and a statement from the towing company confirming you contacted them under false pretenses. We're going to need you to come with us for further questioning." Emma blinked, her head spinning. Security footage? Of course, Jack had cameras. She had seen the tiny black domes mounted around his garage, but she had convinced herself he wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. Now, her actions were laid bare, exposed like dirty laundry for everyone to see. Do I need a lawyer?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you, ma'am," the male officer replied, his tone neither kind nor harsh. "But you'll need to come down to the station tonight." As Emma stepped out into the cold night air, she glanced across the street. Jack's house stood silent, the freedom flag still fluttering defiantly under the glow of his porch light. It was a simple banner, red, white, and blue, with the word freedom emblazoned across it. But to Emma, it had become a symbol of defiance, a challenge to everything she thought Elmwood should represent. She felt the eyes of her neighbors on her as she was led to the squad car. Curtains shifted in windows, shadows moved behind blinds, and she knew the whispers would spread like wildfire by morning. Sinking into the back seat of the police cruiser, Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. The realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't the hero of this story. She was the villain. As the car pulled away from her home, Emma leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The streets of Elmwood passed by in a blur, each house lit warmly from within, each porch a picture of suburban tranquility. She had spent years working to preserve that image, but now she wondered if it had all been for nothing. Her mind drifted back to the first time she saw the flag. It had been a sunny afternoon just weeks ago when Jack Miller moved in. She remembered the way the fabric rippled in the breeze, bold and unapologetic, and how something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just a flag to her, it was a threat. But was it? As the memory unfolded, Emma couldn't help but question whether she had been fighting to protect the neighborhood, or her own fragile sense of control. Shall we dive into part 2 and unfold her descent into conflict? It started innocently enough, as most neighborhood disputes do. The day Jack Miller moved into Elmwood, Emma had been trimming the hydrangeas in her front yard. She prided herself on keeping her garden impeccable, a reflection of her values, order, precision, and control. From her position behind the white picket fence, she spotted a moving truck pulling up to the house across the street, followed by a gleaming black pickup truck. The man who stepped out was tall and broad-shouldered, with a confident stride that immediately struck Emma as, well, un-Elmwood-like. He was a new face, an unfamiliar presence in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business. New neighbors, Emma muttered to herself, clipping a particularly stubborn branch. She made a mental note to introduce herself later, as any good Elmwood resident would. By evening, most of the moving boxes had disappeared from Jack's front yard. Emma, now seated on her porch swing with a glass of iced tea, was watching his house when she first saw it, the flag. It was enormous, at least 5 feet wide, and emblazoned with the word freedom in bold capital letters. Its colors, red, white, and blue, were patriotic but strikingly loud against the subdued tones of Elmwood's carefully curated aesthetic. Jack hung it from a tall pole attached to the back of his truck, which was parked prominently in his driveway. Emma felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't the flag itself. She wasn't anti-patriotic after all. It was the brazenness of it. Elmwood was a place of subtlety and balance, where displays of any kind were frowned upon. Political lawn signs, banned. Holiday decorations, limited to white lights. A flag like that, so assertive, felt like an affront to everything the neighborhood stood for. It's not illegal, she reminded herself, taking a measured sip of her tea. But the thought didn't soothe her. Jack's flag wasn't just a flag, it was a statement. And in Emma's mind, it was the kind of statement that could disrupt the harmony of Elmwood. Jack Miller, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing across the street. For him, the freedom flag wasn't about making a statement. It was about who he was. A retired Marine and lifelong believer in the principles of liberty, Jack had flown a version of that flag everywhere he'd lived. It was a reminder of the sacrifices he and his comrades had made, a nod to the values he held dear. That night, as he sat on his porch sipping a beer, he noticed Emma watching him. She wasn't subtle. Her gaze was sharp and scrutinizing, like a hawk circling prey. Jack offered a friendly wave, but Emma simply turned her head and retreated into her house. "Well, all right then," he muttered, shaking his head with a bemused smile. In the days that followed, Emma's discomfort grew. She began cataloging her grievances: the flag, the truck, the music Jack played while working on his lawn, classic rock, loud enough to hear from her kitchen. She mentioned it casually to her closest friend, Margaret, during their morning walk. "Have you seen that flag?" Emma asked, adjusting her sun hat. Margaret glanced at Jack's house and shrugged. "It's just a flag, Emma. Let the man have his freedom." "It's not about the flag, Margaret," Emma said sharply. "It's the principle. Elmwood has standards. If everyone starts putting up flags and doing whatever they want, this neighborhood will fall apart." Margaret didn't reply, but her silence was telling. For the first time, Emma felt a flicker of doubt. Was she overreacting? Emma's first step was a formal complaint to the Elmwood Homeowners Association. She spent an afternoon drafting a detailed letter outlining how Jack's flag violated the spirit of the community's guidelines. The next week, she received a polite but firm response. "Dear Mrs. Hill, thank you for bringing this to our attention. After reviewing the matter, we have determined that the flag does not violate any HOA regulations. While we understand your concerns, we encourage all residents to respect their neighbors' personal property and expressions of individuality. Sincerely, Elmwood HOA." The letter felt like a slap in the face. Emma had always been a staunch supporter of the HOA, but now they had betrayed her. Or so it seemed. She folded the letter and placed it on her desk, where it sat like an unspoken challenge. If the HOA won't act, I'll have to take matters into my own hands, she thought. The following week, Emma began watching Jack's house with increasing intensity. Every morning she made a point to note whether the flag was up. It always was, fluttering proudly in the breeze, mocking her. She couldn't escape it, not from her living room window, not from her front yard, not even on her evening walks. It was on one such walk that an idea began to take shape. She passed a truck with a towing company logo parked on a side street. The driver, a burly man with grease-stained hands, was chatting with someone on the sidewalk. Emma slowed her pace, her gaze flicking from the truck to Jack's house in the distance. Could she? By the time Emma returned home that evening, her mind was racing. The HOA had failed her, but she wasn't powerless. She had a plan. A risky one, yes, but necessary for the good of the neighborhood. As she dialed the towing company's number, Emma told herself it wasn't personal. She wasn't targeting Jack. She was protecting Elmwood. But deep down, a voice whispered what she refused to admit. This wasn't about the neighborhood. This was about her. Emma's hand hovered over the phone, her breath catching in her throat. She had always been a woman of action, someone who got things done when others hesitated. If no one else will do it, I will, she thought, dialing the number of the towing company. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Premier Towing, how can I help you? Emma straightened in her chair, her voice adopting the confident tone she used at HOA meetings, even though she wasn't officially part of the board. Hello, this is Emma Hill. I'm calling on behalf of the Elmwood Homeowners Association. We have a vehicle in violation of community standards parked at 217 Elmwood Drive. It's displaying unauthorized signage that's not permitted under HOA guidelines. I need it towed immediately. The words spilled out smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if she had rehearsed them in her head a dozen times. The man on the other end hesitated. All right, ma'am. Can you confirm the violation? We just need it on record. Yes, Emma replied, her tone firm. The truck is parked on the street, prominently displaying a large flag that violates our restrictions on external displays. It's disruptive to the neighborhood. The man seemed satisfied. Got it. We'll send someone out in the next hour or so. Emma hung up the phone and let out a long, shaky breath. For a moment she felt victorious, like a general plotting a decisive move in battle. She stood by her window, arms crossed, watching Jack's house. The flag flapped boldly in the afternoon breeze, as if mocking her decision. Soon, it would be gone. Order would be restored. An hour later, the rumble of the tow truck broke the calm of Elmwood's quiet streets. Emma's heart raced as she watched the truck pull up in front of Jack's house. The driver, a burly man in a high-visibility vest, stepped out and began attaching chains to the frame of Jack's truck. Emma's eyes darted from the scene to Jack's house. His curtains were drawn, no sign of movement. Perfect timing, she whispered to herself. The sound of metal scraping against metal made her wince, but her resolve didn't falter. A few scratches on his truck, she reasoned, were a small price to pay for the neighborhood's peace. But then, something unexpected happened. The driver paused, seemingly struggling to secure the chains. He adjusted them once, twice, but they wouldn't hold. The truck jolted slightly as the driver cursed under his breath, and Emma's stomach tightened. The noise was louder than she anticipated, enough to draw attention. A few neighbors began to peek out from their windows, their curious gazes directed at the commotion. Margaret, Emma's closest friend, stepped out onto her porch, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. Emma ducked behind her curtains, her pulse quickening. She hadn't planned for witnesses. Meanwhile, Jack Miller was walking back from the grocery store, a bag of dog food slung over one shoulder and a six-pack of beer in his other hand. As he turned the corner onto Elmwood Drive, he stopped dead in his tracks. His truck was being hooked to a tow truck, the freedom flag still fluttering defiantly behind it. What the hell? He muttered, quickening his pace. Jack dropped the bag of dog food on the curb and marched toward the tow truck. The driver, startled by Jack's sudden approach, straightened up. Hey, what do you think you're doing? Jack demanded, his voice sharp but controlled. The driver raised his hands defensively. Just doing my job, sir. We got a call from your HOA about a violation. Jack's eyes narrowed. Violation? What violation? There's no HOA rule about flags, and my truck's parked legally. I'm just following orders, the driver said with a shrug. Jack turned toward his house and noticed Emma's curtains flutter briefly. His jaw tightened. He had noticed her watching him before, her sharp eyes following his every move. Now, suspicion crystallized into certainty. "Unhook my truck," Jack said, his voice low and steady. The driver hesitated, but, seeing Jack's unwavering glare, relented. With a frustrated sigh, he unhooked the chains, leaving faint scratches on the truck's frame. Jack stepped closer, inspecting the damage, his anger simmering just below the surface. "This isn't over," Jack muttered, his eyes darting toward Emma's house. From her perch behind the curtains, Emma's stomach churned. She had hoped for a clean resolution, but the confrontation had escalated faster than she expected. She watched as Jack stormed into his house, his broad shoulders tense with anger. A cold sweat broke out on Emma's brow. Moments later, Jack emerged with a determined look on his face. He marched toward the end of his driveway and pointed directly at the security camera mounted above his garage. Emma's heart sank. She hadn't thought about the cameras. Jack's lips moved as if he were muttering to himself, and then he pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of the tow truck as it pulled away. Emma knew exactly what he was doing, gathering evidence. As Emma sank into her armchair, a sense of dread washed over her. She had always thought of herself as the protector of Elmwood, the one who kept things in line. But now, she realized she had crossed a line herself. And Jack? Jack wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. The storm was only beginning. Jack didn't waste any time. The scratches on his truck and the blatant lie about the HOA were more than enough to light a fire under him. As soon as the tow truck rumbled away, he went straight to his home office, pulled up the security footage, and pressed play. On the screen it was all there, the tow truck driver struggling with the chains, the scrape against his truck, and most damning of all, Emma's unmistakable silhouette watching from behind her curtains. Jack leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He replayed the footage twice, letting the anger simmer into resolve. "She thinks she can pull one over on me?" he muttered under his breath. "We'll see about that." Meanwhile, Emma sat in her living room, gripping her teacup as if it were an anchor. The calm she had hoped would follow her solution had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Jack's quick reaction and the unmistakable flash of determination in his eyes told her this wasn't over. The next morning, the knock on her door was as sharp as a gunshot. Emma flinched, setting her teacup down with trembling hands. When she opened the door, she was greeted by Officer Davis, a familiar figure in Elmwood who usually handled noise complaints or stray pets. "Mrs. Hill," he said, his tone even but serious. "Your neighbor, Mr. Miller, filed a report about an incident involving his truck being towed. He claims you impersonated a representative of the Elmwood HOA to orchestrate the removal. Is that true?" Emma's blood ran cold. Officer, this is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I was just trying to maintain order in the neighborhood. That flag, it's disruptive." Officer Davis raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Hill, whether you find the flag disruptive or not isn't the issue. Impersonating an HOA representative and filing a false claim with a towing company are serious matters. Do you have any comment on that?" Emma's lips moved, but no words came out. Her mind raced for an excuse, an explanation, anything that would make this go away. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's something you'll need to explain in greater detail," Officer Davis said, pulling out a notepad. "We'll need a formal statement from you. I also advise you to contact a lawyer." By the afternoon, the whole neighborhood knew. Word spread like wildfire in Elmwood, Jack's truck, Emma's call to the towing company, and now the police involvement. At first, Emma tried to deny everything when neighbors approached her. But the security footage Jack had shared with Officer Davis painted an irrefutable picture. "Why would she do something like that?" Margaret asked, during an impromptu gathering on Jack's lawn. Jack, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, shrugged. Control, I guess. Some people can't stand when the world doesn't match their little bubble. The group nodded, murmuring in agreement. Jack had become a neighborhood hero overnight, his calm demeanor and principled stand against Emma's meddling earning him widespread respect. Emma, on the other hand, found herself increasingly isolated. Where once she had been the go-to person for organizing bake sales and holiday decorations, now her phone was silent. Even Margaret, her closest confidant, was keeping her distance. The following week, Jack filed a lawsuit in small claims court. He was seeking damages for the scratches on his truck, the towing fees, and the stress caused by Emma's actions. His lawyer assured him they had a solid case, and Jack, ever the pragmatic former Marine, left no stone unturned. Emma received the court summons on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside, the details of Jack's claims were laid out in cold, formal language, each word hitting her like a slap. "I'm going to lose everything," she whispered, sinking into her armchair. Her savings, her reputation, her place in the community, it was all slipping away. The day of the hearing arrived faster than Emma had expected. She sat in the courtroom, her palms clammy, as Jack and his lawyer presented their case. The security footage was damning, as were the towing company's records, which confirmed Emma had claimed to be part of the HOA. When it was her turn to speak, Emma tried to explain herself. "I didn't mean to cause harm," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought I was doing the right thing for the neighborhood." The judge's expression didn't waver. "Mrs. Hill, your personal feelings about your neighbor's flag do not justify impersonating an HOA representative or making false claims. Your actions were deceptive and caused measurable harm. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Miller." The judgment was swift. Emma was ordered to pay for the damages, towing fees, and court costs. The financial blow was severe, but the social fallout was even worse. As Emma left the courthouse, her head low, the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her shoulders. But the judgment was only part of the price she would pay. The whispers in Elmwood had already begun, and the lines between friend and foe were being drawn. What had started as a crusade to preserve the neighborhood's peace had now become the catalyst for its deepest divisions. And Emma, once its self-appointed guardian, was now its outcast. The walk back to her house that day felt like a gauntlet. Emma Hill kept her head down, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as the familiar, manicured streets of Elmwood seemed to close in on her. Every passing house felt like a silent accusation. Curtains twitched. Porch lights flicked on, though it was still broad daylight. She knew what they were thinking. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were trembling. She fumbled with the key before finally stepping inside, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. The silence in the house was deafening, the usual hum of her life replaced by the crushing weight of solitude. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, but it wasn't the usual flurry of neighborhood group texts or friendly reminders from the HOA. It was her bank, alerting her to the withdrawal she'd just made to pay Jack Miller's damages. The reality of her situation was inescapable. Emma Hill, the self-proclaimed steward of Elmwood, was now its pariah. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to rally behind Jack. The court ruling only cemented his position as the unlikely hero of Elmwood, a man who had stood up against petty tyranny and won. The following weekend, Jack hosted a barbecue. What began as a small gathering of supportive neighbors quickly snowballed into a full-blown block party. Families brought dishes, kids played in the front yard, and the freedom flag flew proudly from Jack's truck, parked in the center of it all like a victorious trophy. Emma watched from her window, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifting across the street. She couldn't look away, even as the scene felt like a knife twisting in her chest. This was the community she had once worked so hard to cultivate. Now, she wasn't even invited. For Jack, the barbecue was more than a celebration, it was a statement. He wasn't just reclaiming his right to fly his flag, he was reclaiming his place in the neighborhood. When someone asked if he planned to take the flag down, his response was simple: Not a chance. Freedom isn't just for some of us, it's for all of us. While Jack's popularity soared, Emma's isolation deepened. Her once busy calendar, filled with coffee dates, book clubs, and Toei events, was now eerily empty. Even Margaret, her closest friend, had grown distant. "I just think you need time," Margaret had said during their last conversation, her tone apologetic but firm. "People are upset, Emma. They need space to cool off." But it wasn't just space they needed. Emma knew it was trust she'd lost, and that was far harder to rebuild. Every interaction with her neighbors felt forced, their polite smiles masking judgment. Grocery store trips became strategic maneuvers to avoid crossing paths with familiar faces. The very streets she once patrolled with pride now felt hostile. One sleepless night, Emma found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. In front of her was a pen and a single envelope addressed to Jack Miller. For weeks she had thought about apologizing, but her pride always stopped her. Now, with the silence of the house pressing down on her, the words began to spill out. "Dear Mr. Miller, I owe you an apology, one I should have given a long time ago. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and I acted in a way that was not only unfair, but also harmful. You didn't deserve that. The flag you fly represents something important to you, and I had no right to take that away. I am sorry for the damage I caused, not just to your property, but to the trust and respect this neighborhood should uphold. Sincerely, Emma Hill." She read the letter twice, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Folding it carefully, she slipped it into the envelope and set it by the door. Tomorrow she would deliver it. It was a small step, but it was all she could manage. The fallout from the incident rippled through Elmwood in unexpected ways. While most rallied around Jack, a small but vocal minority began questioning whether the neighborhood had become too divided. Margaret, despite her distance from Emma, voiced her concerns at a neighborhood meeting. "This was a mistake, yes, but we're not a community if we abandon people the moment they mess up. We need to move forward together." Others disagreed. "Emma brought this on herself," one neighbor retorted. "She lied, manipulated, and tried to control us. That's not someone I want to move forward with." The disagreement drew an invisible line through Elmwood, splitting neighbors who had once been united. The tension Emma feared the freedom flag would bring had arrived, but not because of Jack. It was her own actions that had fractured the community. When Emma finally placed the letter in Jack's mailbox, she didn't expect much. Part of her doubted he would even read it. But a week later, she found a note in her own mailbox. "Emma, thank you for your apology. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I appreciate that you took the time to write this. I accept your apology, but I hope you understand that trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Actions have consequences, and this neighborhood deserves better from all of us. Let's move forward with that in mind. Jack." Emma read the note 3 times, each word both a relief and a reminder of the road ahead. Jack's forgiveness wasn't an invitation to return to her old ways, it was a challenge to be better. Months passed, and while the wounds in Elmwood didn't heal entirely, life began to settle. Emma started small, joining neighborhood cleanups and quietly contributing to community projects. She avoided the spotlight, focusing instead on rebuilding relationships one at a time. Jack continued flying his freedom flag, and though it still ruffled a few feathers, it became a symbol of something greater: resilience, both his and the neighborhood's. The divisions in Elmwood didn't disappear, but perhaps that was the lesson. Community wasn't about everyone agreeing all the time. It was about learning to live together despite their differences. For Emma, the road to redemption was long and humbling, but she walked it with purpose. And for Jack, the fight wasn't just about his flag. It was about the principle that every voice, no matter how small, deserved to be heard. What do you think? Can a community truly recover after being divided, or do old wounds leave scars that never heal? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of justice, growth, and second chances.